Being able to trade down within tiers at positions while still maintaining production is by far the easiest way to add draft capital or more assets in general to your roster, and that is the point of this series throughout this entire 2024 offseason. The way this is going to work is I'm going to show you guys stats from two similar players, but one of them is valued at a premium in startup drafts or trades, and the other is valued as like the generic version of that player, and then we'll break it all down. So first up, we have a wide receiver comparison, and our premium receiver is currently 24 years old, and in his last 17 games played has averaged per game 8.3 targets, 5.3 receptions, 68.5 yards, 0.3 touchdowns, 13.9 fantasy points per game, and has totaled 8 top 24 weeks, 3 of them are top 12. And our generic receiver is currently 27 years old, and in his last 17 games played has averaged per game 7.3 targets, 4.7 receptions, 66.2 yards, 0.35 receiving touchdowns, 13.1 fantasy points per game, with 8 top 24 weeks, 3 of which were top 12. And to further feed this comparison, both wide receivers play for Southern divisions in different conferences. They both have a tight end teammate that went to my alma mater, Penn State, and they both actually have the same first name. All right, now those hints might have given it away, but our premium receiver is Chris Olave, currently valued as wide receiver 11 in July ADP, and our generic receiver is Christian Kirk, currently valued as wide receiver 41, about 5 rounds later in startup value. Oh, and by the way, yes, both of them have the same first name, as Chris Olave is actually short for Christian Olave, so the more you know. So why the discrepancy here? Well, it's all about pedigree and career trajectory. Kirk came into the league like 6 years ago as a second round pick and is on the wrong side of 27, heading quickly for that age 30 mark. He's had some good years of production, specifically 2022 as his first year with the Jaguars, but he just seems locked into a role that is very solid, but doesn't really have overwhelming upside. Olave, on the other hand, is the complete opposite, a top 12 NFL pick who just turned 24 years old a couple weeks ago and is all of the makings of an elite wide receiver one in the league. His only issue is that he seems to be stuck on a really bland offense with subpar quarterback play that's really hindered him now 2 years in a row and is possibly going to continue hindering him for another 2 to 3 more years as long as he's with the Saints. And really, since the start of the offseason, I've actually been pretty against the inflated dynasty value of Chris Olave, who is still holding on to a top 12 dynasty valuation, which I do understand because of his pedigree, but if he has another kind of bleh season with Derek Carr in 2024, his value could tank in 2025 to potentially outside the top 20 because of all the other amazing receivers that we have in the league right now, plus some really good rookies coming in next year. Christian Kirk, though, has been just as productive as Chris Olave over the past 2 years since joining the Jacksonville Jaguars. In 2022, Kirk outscored Olave by a full point per game, and in 2023, Olave outscored Kirk by a full point per game if you exclude the game that Kirk got hurt in and played just one snap. But over the last 17 games, they both have the same fantasy points per game, they both have the same number of top 24 weeks, top 12 weeks, and basically all of their counting stats are nearly identical over the past 2 years. And listen, I'm a huge fan of Brian Thomas Jr. in the Jags offense. I think he has insane upside as the future wide receiver one for Trevor Lawrence, but as of right now, Christian Kirk is their wide receiver one. He was their wide receiver one in 2022, leading the team in all receiving stats across the board, and up until his injury last year, was the wide receiver one on the team in 2023. He was out targeting Calvin Ridley through those first 11 games and was the more productive fantasy player as well. Same goes for Evan Ingram, who Kirk was also out targeting prior to getting hurt, and Ingram's production didn't really explode last year until after Christian Kirk's injury. So if we move into 2024, assuming that at best BTJ takes the Calvin Ridley role, Kirk is more than likely out-targeting him, especially as a rookie, and he's still out-targeting Evan Ingram, so it's very realistic that Kirk returns to his 2022 production of over 14 fantasy points per game as a top 20 fantasy wide receiver, possibly even outscoring Chris Olave once again. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this deal does not come without any risk. It definitely does, given the type of player that Chris Olave is and could still become since he's still only 24 years old. But if you get the right piece added on top of Christian Kirk to even out this trade for Dynasty, this could be a league-winning type of move for you this year. According to our trade analyzer, the difference between the two right now is around the 1.07 in Superflex leagues, which puts you in a guaranteed position to basically get either Rome Odunze, Brock Bowers, or a quarterback in Drake May or JJ McCarthy. Those rookies alone are going to make up the loss of youth moving from Olave to Kirk, but also still allows you to maintain production for 2024 by getting Christian Kirk. If you want to look at a veteran to help you compete this year, there's a multitude of options to go for from here. You could stay young at receiver and go for a Michael Pittman, a Devonta Smith, a DK Metcalf, T. Higgins, or Tank Dell, which keeps some youth on your team at the receiver position and gives you that added production from one of them as well too. You could look at a handful of running backs in this range like Devon Achane, Saquon Barkley, Kyron Williams, or maybe somebody like a Jonathan Brooks, Isaiah Pacheco, or Kenneth Walker, and potentially get like a future second or something added on top of one of them. And you also have some elite tight ends in this range too, like Mark Andrews, Dalton Kincaid, and the upside shot on Kyle Pitts. The point is that there are a ton of options to close the gap between Chris Olave and Christian Kirk, and most of them will help you offset the loss of age and upside with Olave by being young enough and or productive enough this year to make this trade really worth your while. All right, next up we have a quarterback comparison, and our premium quarterback is currently 27 years old, and his last 17 games played has averaged per game 38 pass attempts, 267 passing yards, 1.8 passing touchdowns, 2.3 fantasy points per game just from rushing, 18.9 fantasy points per game total, with 14 top 24 weeks, 10 of which were top 12. And our generic quarterback is currently 29 years old, and in his last 17 games played has averaged per game 35 pass attempts, 269 passing yards, 1.75 passing touchdowns, 0.9 fantasy points per game from rushing, 17.1 fantasy points per game total, with 15 top 24 weeks, 8 of which were top 12. And to further feed the comparison, both quarterbacks play in northern divisions of different conferences. They both are thrown to consensus top 5 Dynasty wide receiver ones, and although they don't share the same first name like Olave and Christian Kirk, they do share the same first letter of their first name. All right, those hints might have given it away, but our premium quarterback is Joe Burrow, currently valued as QB7 in July ADP, and our generic quarterback is Jared Goff, currently valued as QB18 in July ADP, about 3 full rounds later in value in Superflex leagues. So why the discrepancy here? Well, again, it's pedigree and career ceiling. Joe Burrow is the elite young superstar talent who's taken his team to the Super Bowl and is still seen really as like the only threat to Patrick Mahomes in the AFC, whereas Jared Goff is much more of like a game manager plus. He can make all the throws, he can help you win games, but he still doesn't really feel like a guy who's going to carry you to a championship, but rather more be carried himself by the offense and weapons around him. And while I understand the box that we've kind of put Jared Goff into to a degree, I do think that overall he's a very underrated quarterback, especially for fantasy football. Did you know that last year Jared Goff was second in the NFL in passing yards and fourth in the NFL in passing touchdowns? Did you know that he averaged 18 fantasy points per game and was the QB7 in total points on the year, with more top 6 weekly fantasy performances than Patrick Mahomes, Jordan Love, and Tua Tagovailoa, and only one fewer top 6 week than Justin Herbert and Lamar Jackson in the entire 2023 season. So when I see Jared Goff going as the QB 18 in Dynasty ADP, I call that a massive value opportunity. And by comparing him to Joe Burrow, that's not to say that Joe Burrow is overvalued as the QB7. It's just a very easy comparison production-wise and also kind of stylistically wise in terms of just how these quarterbacks win for fantasy. Neither guy is really a mobile quarterback. Burrow will run, and he does add that extra layer of production for fantasy football, but I wouldn't call him a rushing quarterback like some of the other quarterbacks in the league. So really, it just comes down to primary production coming through the passing game, especially when they pair him with those top 5 wide receiver ones that I mentioned before. But when you really look at both of their receiving cores and weapons that they have to throw to, I would actually argue that Jared Goff's weapons are better than Joe Burrow's. Amon-Ra and Jamar Chase just kind of feel like a push, and honestly, Amon-Ra has been much more consistent and healthy the past 2 years, but for argument's sakes, we know what Jamar Chase can do, and I'm going to call this one a push. Now, T. Higgins is way better than Jameson Williams. There is no argument there for me. I can see a world where Jameson closes that gap, but a lot of things have to go right for him this year, whereas Higgins really just needs to return to form after a bad 2023 season. But just as T. Higgins is a lot better than Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta is way better than Mike Gesicki, and I'd even go as far as saying that Laporta is better than Jermaine Burton as well too. And then no one's going to argue that Jahmyr Gibbs is by far the best running back on these two teams, and even David Montgomery is by far the second best running back on these two teams. So collectively, I think Jared Goff has better weapons to throw to than Joe Burrow. And if you're a Superflex team with Burrow looking to make a move or upgrade a lineup spot somewhere, take a look at Joe Burrow for Jared Goff plus. According to our analyzer, the difference between the two in Superflex leagues is about the 1.05 in rookie drafts, which in some leagues could potentially be Malik Neighbors, but more likely it's Rome Odunze, Brock Bowers, Drake May, or JJ McCarthy. But I would venture to say that it is still very possible to get Jared Goff plus the 103 or 104 if that person really wants Joe Burrow, so you could maybe more easily come away with Malik Neighbors or Jaden Daniels instead. Now, if you're looking at veterans to help you compete and fill in or upgrade a roster spot, you could take a look at wide receivers like Jalen Waddle, Brandon Ayuk, Drake London, or maybe even Tyreek Hill if the team is looking to start rebuilding and wants to shed some age. Maybe you can snag a running back like Jonathan Taylor, Travis Etienne, or Devon Achane, or again, maybe you can sneak away a Christian McCaffrey if that team is really looking to rebuild and wants to take on Joe Burrow. And at the tight end position, you basically have your pick of the entire litter at the position with Trey McBride as a very good value add, or maybe you can nail down the stack of Jared Goff and Sam Laporta for Joe Burrow. Really, the point with both of these trade downs is maintaining production, but getting a big piece on top to make the loss of value more than worth it, especially if you are a contender. I wouldn't make trades just to get off of Joe Burrow or get off of Chris Olave, but if you can make the pieces of this trade fit, these could be moves that help you win a championship in 2024.